Welcome to the session on Marxian dialectical method. Karl Marx studied at the University of Berlin, where he was involved with the young Hegelian movement. Marx inherited the familiar Hegelian picture of human destiny. History has a movement that in some way mirrors the development of the human soul. Consequently, Marx's account of the process whereby labor finally overcomes its own alienation has obvious parallels with some of the Hegel's arguments. But from the beginning, Marx wished to break with the idealist metaphysics in terms of which Hegelian vision had been expressed. Indeed, just as Engels maintained, Marx's approach stood Hegel, that is his dialectical method, on his feet instead of his head. Thus, the mature Marxian theory represents the progressive movement of history in terms of its synthesis of history, economics and philosophy, which is popularly known as dialectical materialism. Materialism, dialectical and historical. Marxism in its most popular version combines the dialectics of a materialistic philosophy and that of a science of history. The materialistic philosophy derives largely from the works of Friedrich Engels. There are, in Engels' view, contradictions in the material world, not only in thought. Natural phenomena can be properly understood and explained only in a dialectical framework, which he maintained in the Dialectics of Nature, contains three basic laws of universal application. First, the transformation of quantity into quality, so that under certain conditions there is revolutionary leap from a difference in degree to a difference in kind. Secondly, the interpenetration of opposites. And thirdly, the law of the negation, which does not lead back to the starting point, but spirals towards a new synthesis. According to Engels, Marx had rightly preserved Hegel's dialectical method, but based on the above laws, supplied a materialistic basis for it, paving way to a science of history. Hegel had seen history as the development of consciousness. Marx argued that the fundamental things that develop and so bring about the movement of history are not features of consciousness at all, but material forces. The development of consciousness is to be explained in terms of the material reality and does not explain it. Hence, the famous phrase of Engels quoted above, that is, Marx's theory of history sets Hegel on his feet. The Marxian science of history is founded on the outline of the historical method presented in Marx's preface to A Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, selective readings of the Communist Manifesto, Volume 1 of Das Kapital, and other writings of Marx that were available at the time of his death, and the more general historical and political works of Engels. In tune with Engels' basic laws, Marx's preface sketches a view of society as consisting of an economic foundation, upon which rises a political and legal superstructure, and to which correspond forms of social thought. Thus, the theory of history begins from the distinction between base and superstructure. System of economic relations as the base. The base of all human institutions is that upon which the forms of consciousness are built, and in terms of which institutions and the consciousness which derives from them are to be explained. This base consists for Marx in two parts. First, a system of economic relations. Secondly, certain active productive forces. Let us see what are these productive forces. The existence of any particular system of economic relations is explained in terms of the level of development of the productive forces. These forces consist of labor power and accumulated knowledge. As man's mastery over nature increases, the productive forces will inevitably develop. At each level of development, the particular system of economic relations will be most suited to contain and facilitate their operation. Thus, the existence of any given economic system in terms of its suitability to the productive forces, which were they at a different stage of development, would either not require or else actively destroy it. superstructure and false consciousness. Upon the system of economic relations rises the superstructure of legal and political institutions. These serve to consolidate and protect the economic base and are therefore similarly explicable in terms of their sustaining and protective function. Finally, the political institutions generate their own peculiar ideology. This is the system of beliefs, perceptions, values and prejudices which together consolidate the entire structure and serve both to conceal the changeability and to dignify the actuality of each particular arrangement. This is what collectively called the false consciousness. Dialectics of history. Within the framework set so far, Marx envisages as the fundamental source of social change to be transformations of economic relations which themselves result from the development of productive forces. The major economic arrangements that Marx discusses are primitive communism, slavery, feudalism and capitalism. Labor is portrayed as the human essence and the driving force of history for its evolution through these systems towards the culmination in communism. It is labor which appears in the fictive forms of market value, and it is labor which can be alienated from and restored to itself, determining thereby the happiness and misery of mankind. In primitive societies, property was held in common. People were not alienated from their labor, but at the same time human productive forces were too poorly developed. The growth of the forces of production led to feudal system of society, in which the serf who was subordinate to the feudal lord had to work on the lord's land rather than on his own land. The vastly greater development of productive forces that took place under the Industrial Revolution resulted in capitalism. And it is under capitalism that labor, which is the human essence for Marx, is abused in the worst way. Marx took over from the political economist David Ricardo the so-called labor theory of value. This explains the exchange value of a commodity in terms of the socially necessary hours of labor required to produce or reproduce it. According to Marx, objectified labor is the predetermined amount for which the capitalist pays. For instance, the workers labor for 12 hours. This is labor as a commodity. The exchange value of this commodity is the amount needed to produce it. That is, the amount needed to keep the worker alive and reproductive. But there is a dual nature to the exchange of labor and capital. The capitalist obtains the worker's labor power for the prescribed period, say 1 day, and can use this labor power to produce as much wealth as he is able to get out of it. This is what Marx means when he says that capital buys living labor. The worker gets a fixed sum regardless of what the capitalist can make out of his labor power. Thus, by exchanging his means of subsistence, which serves to produce his labor power and is therefore the true price of labor for hours of labor in excess of those needed to produce those means, living labor is extorted from the worker. This, according to Marx, leads to the accumulation of surplus. Marx thus portrays a theory of exploitation. He postulates that the production of surplus value must necessarily proceed through the extraction of hours of unpaid labor. Hence, capitalistic relations are necessarily exploitative. Thus, Marx's critique of capitalism comes to rest on an ingenious and scientifically phrased theory of exploitation. This theory only tangentially makes contact with observations as to how the state of man under capitalism is experienced, but it makes explicit how the resultant false consciousness is worst among all the vicissitudes it has seen over the course of history. In the capitalist society, false consciousness may not be a form of unhappiness, but its evil lies in the fact that it inevitably endorses exploitation through its inability to perceive the exploitation that is there. The forced labor of the serf for the feudal lord still exists as the forced labor of the worker for the capitalist. The difference is that under feudalism, the nature and extent of the forced labor is apparent, whereas under capitalism, the nature and extent of the coercion is disguised. workers appear to be free laborers, voluntarily making agreements with the capitalists. In fact, the position of workers as a class in relation to the capitalists as a class means that they are not free. They must take the terms that the capitalists offer them or starve, and capitalists will only employ them under terms which allow surplus value to be extracted from their labor. This is not because capitalists are cruel or greedy, though some may be, but because of the economic laws inherent in capitalist production, which through free competition coerce individual capitalists as much as individual workers. Though equally coerced, capitalists suffer less from this coercion than workers. Now, labor, which is portrayed as the substance of exploitation in the capitalist economy, is for Marx also the driving force of history. Therefore, this system cannot continue as such forever. It should pave way to negation of the negation. The state, together with all its apparatus and the false consciousness which surrounds it, will finally wither away. This state of communism is inevitable simply because productive forces are bound to develop beyond the point where capitalism could contain them. Having developed to that point, the fetter of capitalism will be broken asunder, and communism, which is the only economic arrangement suitable to the enormous levels of development which will by then have been achieved, must necessarily come in place of it. Towards the end of first volume of Capital, Marx sketches how the laws of capitalism will bring about the destruction of capitalism. On the one hand, competition between capitalists will lead to an ever diminishing number of monopoly capitalists. On the other hand, the misery, oppression, slavery, degradation and exploitation of the working class grows. But working class is, because of the nature of capitalist production, more numerous and better organized. Eventually, they will unleash their power. The ensuing revolution will overthrow capitalism, but that will not mean a return to private property in the old sense, but to property based on the gains made under capitalism. That is, on cooperation and common possession of land and the means of production. Capitalism will make this transition relatively easy, since it has already expropriated all private property into its own hands. All that is now necessary is for the masses of the people expropriate these few expropriators. This transition, however, will be impossible without a violent revolution, such as had supposedly attended the transition from feudalism to bourgeois mercantilism in 18th century France. Communism. The dialectical movement of history culminates in communism. With the establishment of communism, according to Marx, the riddle of history is solved. Under communism, men will live in a state of unmediated fellowship, on equal terms, neither exploited nor exploiting, in a world where each gives according to his ability and each takes according to his need. The split between particular interests of the individual and the common interests of the society will disappear, and with it will disappear the state. For state develops as an independent entity to resolve such conflicts. In a communist society, the reconciliation of particular interests of the individual and the common interest of the society is bound to be achieved systematically for various reasons. First of all, in a communist society, there will be no private property. Everything will be owned by the commune as a whole. Secondly, the division of labor will not force people into narrow occupational roles. One could, Marx says, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, breed cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner just as one likes, without ever becoming a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman or a critic. But the most important aspect is that of a radical transformation of human nature that happens under communism. It consists in the vanishing of false consciousness of any sort. A communist society differs from all previous societies in that there will be no false consciousness. False consciousness involves failing to see things as they really are. It comes about because a society's superstructure can conceal the real basis of the society as the legal freedom of the worker to sell his labor to whomsoever he likes, on whatever terms he likes, conceals the fact that he is really no more able to avoid exploitation by capitalists than the feudal serf is free to avoid working on the land of his lord. Class morality adds an extra layer of false consciousness, leading the worker to believe that the capitalist has a moral right to the proceeds of his investment. With communist production, there will be no exploitation to be concealed. Everything will be really as it appears to be. Moral illusions will crumble along with the religious illusions. The new human morality will not cloak sectional interests in a universal guise. It will genuinely serve the interests of all human beings. Now, with the reconciliation of interests and establishment of such ideal conditions for production, communism allows the forces of production to develop to their fullest possible extent. Production will be cooperatively planned for the benefit of all, and not wasted in socially fruitless competition between individual capitalists for their own private ends. There will be no crisis of overproduction as there are in unplanned economies. Mechanization and automation will continue to develop as they had developed under capitalism, though without their degrading effect on the workers. No longer will surplus value be extracted from the workers to line the pockets of the capitalists. The working class will receive the full use value of its labor, subject only to a deduction for future social investment. People will control their economy instead of being controlled by it. Let us summarize. Preserving Hegel's dialectical method, supplying a materialistic basis for it, Marx formulates a science of history. Hegel had seen history as the development of consciousness. Marx argues that the fundamental things that develop and so bring about the movement of history are not features of consciousness at all, but material forces. The development of consciousness is to be explained in terms of the material reality and does not explain it. In tune with Engels' principles as to the dialectics of material nature, Marx sketches a view of society as consisting of an economic foundation, upon which rises a political and legal superstructure, and to which correspond forms of social thought. The existence of any particular system of economic relations is explained in terms of the level of development of the productive forces. Within this framework, Marx envisages as the fundamental source of social change to be transformations of economic relations, which themselves result from the development of productive forces. Some assignments. Do you think that communism is a historical necessity as Marx envisages? If yes, justify your answer. If no, what other social arrangements do you propose to be ideal and why? Another, do you assess the Marxian prediction of withering away of state in a communist social order to be realistic? And one more, has Marx been wrong in his expectations as to the change in human nature that an egalitarian social order would bring about? Elucidate with reference to the contemporary social reality. Some references now. Philosophy and Myth in Karl Marx by Robert Tucker, published in 1961 by Cambridge University Press. Another, Karl Marx Selected Writings, edited by David McClellan, published in 1977 by Oxford University Press. And one more, Marx and Engels, Basic Writings on Politics and Philosophy, edited by Lewis Feuer, published in 1959, Doubleday, Anchor, New York. With that, we come to the end of this session. We'll meet again with another session on another topic. Till then, goodbye.